The morning was cold and grey, the kind of damp chill that seeped into the bones of the Nissen huts at High Wycombe. Inside the office of Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, two men stood amidst the quiet hum of a headquarters, not yet fully awake. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, had just taken formal command. His eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned the room, a space that represented the very spearhead of American air power in Europe. Then his gaze fixed on a sign, prominently displayed on the wall behind Kepner's desk. The message was stark, painted in clear, uncompromising letters. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle read it once, then again, his face an unreadable mask. He turned to Kepner, his voice quiet, yet carrying a weight that filled the room. "That sign needs to come down, Bill," he said. "It is wrong." Kepner was taken aback. "Jimmy, that doctrine is the foundation of our entire escort policy. The bomber crews. The bomber crews are being slaughtered." Doolittle interrupted, not with anger, but with the cold precision of an engineer stating an irrefutable fact. "We are losing this war of attrition. That sign represents a defensive mentality, and in the air, defense is a recipe for defeat." Within hours, the old sign was gone. In its place, a new directive was hung. Its message a radical declaration of a new kind of war. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. This single, quiet moment in a drab English office would mark one of the most consequential tactical decisions of World War II. A complete reversal of fighter doctrine that would shatter the Luftwaffe within weeks. What bomber crews would initially call suicide, and what some commanders would label as reckless, would prove to be the strategic masterstroke that won air supremacy over Europe. The mathematics of aerial warfare were about to be rewritten, not through technological innovation alone, but through one general's willingness to sacrifice sacred doctrine for victory. The crisis had been building for months, a slow motion catastrophe unfolding in the frozen skies over the Reich. On October 14, 1943, a date that would live in infamy for the mighty 8th, 291 American B-17 Flying Fortresses launched the second raid on Schweinfurt, deep in the industrial heart of Germany. The target was critical. Ball-bearing plants that produced components essential for every piece of German machinery from tanks to aircraft. The Americans reached the target through a storm of flak and fighters, dropping their bombs with devastating accuracy. But the cost was catastrophic. 60 bombers, massive 10-man fortresses, failed to return to England. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 600 men, gunners, navigators, pilots, bombardiers, were dead, missing, or destined for prisoner of war camps, all in a single afternoon. For the American bomber crews, this was the brutal arithmetic of their existence. They faced odds that made completing a required 25-mission tour statistically unlikely. During the worst periods of 1942 and 1943, survival rates plummeted to between 25 and 35%. They called themselves the Lost Battalion of the Air. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belly, one of the few crews to miraculously complete their tour, wrote in his diary the night of the second Schweinfurt raid, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell. The forts protect themselves well, but it is not enough. We need the fighters to go all the way with us, or we need to stop flying." The German fighters had developed devastatingly effective tactics. They would form up well beyond the range of the Allied escort fighters, then attack in mass formations. They perfected the head, on pass, streaking through the bomber formations where closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour, giving American gunners mere seconds to react. The Foch Wolf 190s, in particular, some equipped with heavy 13mm cannons and underwing air-to-air rockets, could destroy a B-17 with a single, shattering hit. The problem was brutally simple. American escort fighters, the twin-boomed P-38 Lightnings and the rugged P-47 Thunderbolts, lacked the range to accompany the bombers to distant targets. Their internal fuel tanks were insufficient, and their early external drop tanks were plagued with problems. Over Schweinfurt, the escorts had turned back, their fuel gauges dipping into the red, a full 300 miles from the target. The bombers had to continue alone, fighting for their lives against a German fighter force that could attack, break off, re-arm, refuel, and attack again with impunity. The pressure from Washington was immense. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, issued a stark ultimatum to his commanders in Europe in December 1943. Unless the German Air Force is destroyed, he stated, Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy cannot proceed. The risk to the invasion fleet and the ground forces from an intact Luftwaffe is unacceptable. American bombers cannot continue to sustain such losses. Find a solution, or the strategic bombing campaign will be suspended. The solution, or at least the tool for it, had begun to arrive in November 1943 in the form of a sleek, silver fighter that seemed to possess almost magical capabilities. The North American P-51 Mustang, initially designed to a British specification, was transformed from a good fighter into a war-winning weapon by the installation of a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in the United States. The Merlin, with its two-stage supercharger, produced 195 horsepower at war emergency power and thrived in the thin, cold air of high altitude. With a newly designed laminar, flow wing and elegant lines, the Mustang was a pilot's dream. But its most incredible feature was its range. With the addition of two underwing droppable fuel tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers over 600 miles to any target in Germany and back. It cruised at over 425 miles per hour, faster in level flight than anything the Germans could put in the air. It could reach 41,000 feet and fight effectively at heights where the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s struggled to maneuver. Captain Chuck Yeager, then a young pilot with the 357th Fighter Group, later described the aircraft's impact in his combat report. The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we have an aircraft that can go anywhere the bombers go and fight when we get there. This changes everything. But having the range to escort the bombers all the way to the target was only half the solution. The tactical employment of those escorts would determine victory or defeat. Under the previous doctrine, championed by Major General Ira Eaker, the outgoing commander of the 8th Air Force, fighters flew in tight, rigid formations close to the bomber boxes. They were shepherds, their primary duty to stay within visual range of their flock at all times. If German fighters attacked, the American escorts would engage them, but only long enough to drive them off before immediately returning to their close, defensive stations. The priority was always reactive protection. This defensive posture created a fatal dynamic. German pilots held the initiative. They could choose the time, place, and method of attack. They massed beyond visual range, coordinated their assaults, dove through the bomber formations at maximum speed, inflicted casualties, and then used their knowledge of the terrain and available airfields to escape, before American fighters could effectively counterattack. The American escorts were perpetually reacting, always on the back foot, dancing to the Luftwaffe's tune. Jimmy Doolittle saw the situation with a different set of eyes. He was not a bomber pilot. He was a fighter pilot, a celebrated test pilot, a racing champion, and a man who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He understood aircraft performance and energy management in a way few of his contemporaries could match. More importantly, he understood the fundamental dynamics of combat. The raid that had made him a national hero, the April 18, 1942, Doolittle raid on Tokyo, had been audacious, technically brilliant, and strategically offensive. He had received the Medal of Honor for personally leading that suicidal mission launched from an aircraft carrier. Now he commanded the 8th Air Force with a direct mandate from General Arnold to solve the fighter problem, no matter the cost to tradition. On January 6, 1944, his first full day in command, Doolittle met with General Kepner and issued his revolutionary order. The fighters were no longer to stay defensively chained to the bombers. Instead, they would be unleashed. They would fly ahead of the bomber stream, ranging up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles to either side, actively hunting German fighters. They would seek out the enemy in the air, on their airfields, during their form-up. They would take the fight to the Luftwaffe. Furthermore, after the bombers had completed their attacks and turned for home, the American fighters would not dutifully accompany them. Instead, they would sweep across the German countryside at low altitude, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, attacking trains, trucks, and fuel depots. The goal was not merely to protect the bombers on a single mission, but to systematically destroy the Luftwaffe as a coherent fighting force. To rip its heart out. The order sent shockwaves through the 8th Air Force. American fighter pilots, who had chafed under the restrictive defensive doctrine, were ecstatic. Colonel Donald Blakesley, the hard, bitten commander of the legendary 4th Fighter Group, understood immediately. Gathering his pilots, he told them, "This is what we have been asking for, freedom to hunt. We are no longer shepherds guarding sheep, we are wolves. From now on we kill." But in the bomber stations, the reaction was one of sheer terror. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard, an operations officer with the 354th Fighter Group, captured the bomber crew's perspective after a tense briefing. "The men flying the forts and liberators think we are abandoning them," he noted. "They believe fighters leaving them alone to hunt Germans elsewhere is insanity. They do not understand that killing German fighters before they reach the bombers is better protection than shooting them down after they have already attacked." The bomber crew's fears were not irrational. They had survived previous missions only because the P-47s and P-30As had stayed close, visibly driving off attackers. Now, those familiar, comforting silhouettes would disappear over the horizon minutes after crossing the enemy coast, leaving the vast, vulnerable bomber streams apparently defenseless. Many crews believed Doolittle's order was a death sentence written by a general who, for all his fame, did not understand their war. The German reaction to these new American tactics would ultimately validate or condemn Doolittle's gamble. For the Luftwaffe, the winter of 1943-44 had seemed like approaching victory in the defense of the Reich. Despite 3 years of Allied bombing, German fighter production, under the ruthless efficiency of Albert Speer, had actually increased. Messerschmitt and Foch Wolf factories were delivering over 1,000 fighters every month. German pilots, the veterans at least, had developed lethally effective tactics against the American combat boxes. The heavily armed Sturmbok, battering ram Foch, Wolf 190s, carrying 30mm cannons in underwing pods, were designed to slaughter bombers in a single, devastating pass. These were escorted by lighter, faster Messerschmitt Bf-109s whose job was to engage and tie up the American escorts while the Sturmbok formations massacred the unguarded bombers. Major General Adolf Galland, the brilliant and charismatic commander of the German fighter forces, believed the Luftwaffe was winning the war of attrition. In November 1943, He reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, "The American bomber losses are unsustainable. If we maintain this pressure, they will be forced to abandon daylight bombing by spring." But Gallen's analysis contained a fatal blind spot. He focused on aircraft production numbers while overlooking the hemorrhage of his most precious resource, the pilots. Germany was building fighters faster than the Allies could destroy them in the air or on the ground. But Germany could not replace experienced pilots at anywhere near the rate they were being killed in combat. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 3,000 fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing. Training time for new pilots had been slashed from 250 hours to 150 hours to meet the desperate demand. New German pilots were entering combat with barely enough skill to take off and land their complex aircraft, let alone fight effectively against the increasingly experienced American aviators. Feldwebel Hans Dammers, a Messerschmitt 109 pilot with 8 victories, wrote to his brother in January 1944, describing the problem with stark clarity. "The new pilots last 3, maybe 4 missions before they are killed. They do not know how to dogfight. They cannot work with their wingmen. They freeze when attacked. We veterans must protect them while also fighting the Americans. It is becoming impossible." The atrocious winter weather in early 1944 delayed the full-scale test of Doolittle's new tactics. Day after day, winter storms swept across the Channel, grounding the vast fleets of bombers. But on January 29th, the skies cleared. Over 800 B-17s and B-24s launched against Frankfurt, and for the first time, the new American fighter tactics were unleashed in force. P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group, their sleek bodies glinting in the high-altitude sun, roared ahead of the bomber stream at 28,000 feet. They flew not in tight, energy-sapping formations, but in loose, fluid, finger-4 elements that maximized visibility and reaction time. They were not tied to specific bomber boxes. They were hunters, their eyes scanning the vast expanse of sky for any sign of the enemy. Near Bonn, they spotted their prey, a formation of nearly 50 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, climbing laboriously to intercept the bombers. The Germans, expecting to attack the bombers at their leisure, were caught completely by surprise. The Mustangs, with their superior speed and altitude advantage, dove on them like hawks. The combat was short, sharp, and merciless. It lasted 8 minutes. When it was over, 13 German fighters were spiraling down in flames or breaking up in the air. 2 Mustangs were lightly damaged, but both returned to base. The remaining German formation scattered in disarray and never reached the bombers. Captain Don Gentile, leading a flight of the 4th Fighter Group, on a similar mission that day, described the new tactics effect after encountering a group of Foch Wolf 190s forming up over Cologne. "We caught 20 Foch Wolves forming up. They were slow, heavy with ammunition and fuel, climbing to attack the bombers. We had speed, altitude, and surprise. It was a slaughter. We destroyed 11 before the rest could escape. This is how you win a war." The bomber crews flying over Frankfurt that day noticed something remarkable, something they had not experienced in months. The usual, relentless German fighter attacks, which typically began far from the target and continued in waves throughout the bomb run, barely materialized. A few isolated, desperate attacks occurred, but the mass formations that had devastated the Schweinfurt raids never appeared. The new fighter tactics had intercepted and broken them up long before they could get to the bomber stream. But the true, ultimate test of Doolittle's strategy came in February 1944, with Operation Argument, soon immortalized as Big Week. General Karl Tui Spatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, designed the operation as a masterstroke of bait and destruction. American bombers would strike a series of German aircraft factories in targets so critical that the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to defend them with every available fighter. The goal was not primarily to destroy the factories, though that would be a welcome bonus. The primary goal was to force the Luftwaffe into a series of decisive battles of attrition against the American fighters that now outnumbered, outperformed, and were now free to outfight their German opponents. February 20th, 1944. For the first time in weeks, clear skies stretched over the heart of Germany. Over 1,000 American bombers from bases in England and Italy, escorted by nearly 900 fighters, launched against a dozen different aircraft production facilities. It was the largest single-day air armada in history, a spectacle of raw industrial power and human courage. Major Erich Hartmann, Germany's eventual leading ace with 352 victories, watched the vast American formation pass overhead from his airfield and understood immediately what was happening. "This is not a bombing raid," he told his squadron. "This is a fighter battle with bombers as the excuse. They want us to come up and fight, and we have no choice." The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. Over 900 German fighters of all types scrambled to intercept the American formations. The sky over central Germany erupted into the largest, most chaotic air battle in history. Contrails from thousands of aircraft crisscrossed the heavens at altitudes from sea level to 40,000 feet, a scribbled testament to the fury of the combat. But this time, the American fighters were not tied defensively to the bomber boxes. They were everywhere: P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, and even long-range P-38 Lightnings ranged across hundreds of miles of German airspace, attacking German fighters wherever they found them. On the ground as they tried to take off, in their vulnerable form, up areas, as they climbed toward the bombers, as they tried to disengage and land. The hunting was relentless. Lieutenant Urban, Ben, Drew of the 361st Fighter Group, flying his P-51 Detroit Miss, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, Germany's revolutionary new wonder weapon, taking off from an airfield near Leipzig. The jets were terrifyingly fast and deadly once airborne, but in the vulnerable moments of takeoff, they were slow and low. Drew dove from 30,000 feet, screaming through a maelstrom of light flak, and opened fire on the lead jet as its wheels left the runway. The Me-262 exploded in a fireball. He swerved and destroyed a second jet before it could gain speed. The remaining jets aborted their takeoff and scattered. Drew's combat report became legendary. "The jets are dangerous in the air," he wrote, "but they must take off and land like any aircraft. Catch them there, and they burn like any other." The first day of Big Week cost the Americans 21 bombers and 4 fighters. By the horrific standards of Schweinfurt, just 3 months earlier, these losses were miraculously light. But the German losses were catastrophic. Over 50 fighters were destroyed in the air. More critically, 38 pilots were killed or seriously wounded. For the next 5 days, whenever the weather permitted, the attacks continued. American bombers struck Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt again, Gotha, Augsburg. Each raid brought hundreds of bombers and their Hunter, killer fighter escorts. Each raid forced the Luftwaffe to respond with its dwindling pool of experienced pilots. Each raid cost Germany fighters and, more importantly, pilots it could not replace. Major Heinz Bahr, a German ace with over 220 victories, described the impossible situation in his diary. "We shoot down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. We form up and they attack us before we can attack. We land to refuel and they strafe the airfield. We take off and they are waiting. There is no escape. For every bomber we destroy, we lose 2 fighters and pilots. The arithmetic is simple, and it is fatal." By February 25th, when Big Week concluded, the statistics told the story of a decisive Allied victory. American losses: 226 heavy bombers, 28 escort fighters, approximately 600 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. These were serious, painful losses. But American production lines and training schools could replace the aircraft and men within a matter of weeks. German losses: over 350 fighters destroyed. Another 90 damaged beyond repair. More devastatingly, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 100 pilots killed and over 50 seriously wounded. These were not just pilots. They were the squadron leaders, the group commanders, the aces, the men with an average of over 3 years of combat experience. They were irreplaceable. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Illefeld, commander of a Jagdgeschwader fighter wing, wrote in his after-action report to Galland, "We are losing the most experienced men. The new pilots cannot survive against the American fighters. Within 3 months, we will have aircraft, but no one capable of flying them in combat." But Doolittle's strategy extended far beyond air to air combat. The second phase of his directive, the strafing attacks on German airfields and infrastructure, proved equally, if not more, devastating. Every day, as the American fighters returned from their escort missions, they would drop down to treetop level and race across the German countryside, hunting for targets of opportunity. Airfields suffered particularly heavy damage. Fighters parked in the open, aircraft undergoing maintenance, fuel bowsers, hangars, radar stations, and even locomotives all became targets. German pilots described the psychological terror of returning from an exhausting combat mission, low on fuel and ammunition, only to find their home airfield under attack by marauding Mustangs, forcing them to divert to secondary fields or attempt a landing amid craters and burning wreckage. Major General, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, described the psychological impact. "We're used to feel safe on our own airfields. Now, nowhere is safe. The Americans attack morning, noon, and evening. Pilots survive combat only to die on the ground. Mechanics are killed servicing aircraft. Fuel trucks explode. We cannot maintain operations under this constant attack. The strain on the men is unbearable." The cumulative effect of this relentless pressure began showing in its full, horrifying scope for the Luftwaffe in March 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched its first major raids on Berlin itself. The symbolic and strategic importance of the capital meant the Luftwaffe had to respond with every fighter it could scrape together. On March 6, 1944, 730 bombers, escorted by over 800 fighters, struck Berlin. The Luftwaffe responded with a maximum effort, scrambling over 150 fighters. The resulting battle raged across hundreds of miles of sky, a sprawling, brutal engagement that saw fighters clashing while the bombers doggedly pressed on toward their targets. When the tally was complete, the Americans had lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters, a heavy price, but the Germans had lost 160 aircraft destroyed and another 50 damaged. The pilot casualties were staggering, nearly 70 experienced fighter pilots killed or wounded in a single day. For the Luftwaffe, it was an unmitigated disaster from which recovery was impossible. Captain Johannes Mackie Steenhoff, a group commander with Jagdgeschwader 52, survived the March 6th battle and wrote in his diary that evening, "Today I watched the German fighter arm die. We threw everything against them, and it was not enough. They shot us down faster than we could shoot them down. Their losses are temporary. Ours are permanent. The war is lost in the air." Between January and May 1944, the cumulative attrition became unsustainable. German fighter pilot losses exceeded 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. This represented nearly 1/4 of all fighter pilots available at the start of the period. More critically, the losses fell heaviest on the most experienced pilots, the veterans, the men with dozens or even hundreds of victories, the squadron and group commanders, the instructors. They were systematically killed because they were the most aggressive, because they led from the front, because they tried to protect the inexperienced newcomers. 20. 8 German aces with over 30 kills died between January and May 1944. 8 aces with over 100 kills were killed or captured. Each of these men represented years of training and thousands of hours of combat experience. Each was literally irreplaceable. The training pipeline could not keep pace. In 1944, Germany would graduate about 29 Zaragoza new fighter pilots, but their training time had fallen to just 110 hours of total flight time by mid-year, with some late war pilots receiving as little as 50 hours. American pilots in the same period received over 450 hours of training, including 250 hours in their actual combat aircraft. The qualitative gap was now a chasm. Major Hans Philipp, a German ace with 206 victories, described the new pilot situation in his final letter home, before being killed in action in October 1943, a prophecy that was now coming true with a vengeance. The boys arrive at the squadron unable to fly formation properly. They do not understand tactical principles. They panic under fire. In combat with experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft, they survive 1, maybe 2 missions, then they die. We cannot teach them fast enough. There is no time. The disparity in aircraft production told another devastating part of the story. In the first 6 months of 1944, American factories produced over 20 Zaragoza fighter aircraft. German factories, despite heroic dispersal efforts to evade bombing, produced around 9,000 fighters. The numerical advantage alone was overwhelming, but when combined with the qualitative advantage of the P-51 and the new tactical freedom, it became decisive. Colonel Hubert Hub, Zenk, commanding the renowned 56th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts, noted the combined effect. We have more fighters, better trained pilots, better tactics, and unlimited fuel and ammunition. The Germans have brave men flying good aircraft. They cannot keep supplied or properly maintained. Courage cannot overcome such a disadvantage forever. By April 1944, the transformation was complete. German fighter strength, measured in operational aircraft, and, more importantly, combat-effective pilots, had fallen to less than 60% of its January levels. The veteran formations that had savaged bomber raids in October 1943 no longer existed. The new Luftwaffe consisted largely of inexperienced, frightened boys flying aircraft with insufficient fuel, inadequate ammunition, and minimal maintenance, facing American formations that grew larger and more confident with each passing mission. On May 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched nearly 900 bombers to attack oil refineries and marshalling yards across Germany. Over 750 escort fighters accompanied them. For the first time in the air war over Europe, not a single German fighter rose to intercept. The Luftwaffe had conceded the sky without a fight. General Galland reported to Joe Ring that day with grim finality. The fighter force is, for the moment, destroyed. We have aircraft but cannot fly them for lack of fuel. We have pilots but most cannot fight effectively. The Americans attack at will. We can no longer contest their air superiority. The strategic impact of this achievement became undeniably clear on June 6, 1944. D-Day. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on the first day of the invasion. The Luftwaffe fighters, operating from bases just a few minutes' flight from the Normandy beaches, managed to fly fewer than 300 sorties. The disparity was so complete that Allied ground attack aircraft, like the P-47s and British Typhoons, were able to roam almost at will, devastating German positions, smashing armoured columns, and isolating the battlefield. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, sent an urgent, despairing message to Hitler on June 10. The enemy has complete air superiority. Our troops cannot move in daylight without being attacked. Our supplies cannot reach the front. Without air cover, we cannot hold the invasion beaches. The transformation from the dark days of October 1943 to the triumphant summer of 1944 was staggering. 6 months earlier, the Luftwaffe had seemed capable of bleeding the American bomber offensive to death. Now, they were effectively extinct as a coherent fighting force over Western Europe. The statistics of those crucial 6 months tell the story of a systematic, calculated destruction. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 500 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded in combat over the Reich. This represented approximately 75% of the available fighter pilot force at the start of the period. American losses in the same period totaled approximately 420 fighter pilots killed or missing and 7,000 bomber crew casualties. These were sobering, painful losses, but American training capacity and aircraft production ensured they were sustainable. The kill ratios had reversed completely. In October 1943, German fighters had been destroying American bombers at a rate that made the campaign unsustainable. By May 1944, American fighters were destroying German fighters at a ratio of nearly 4-1. But beyond the cold numbers, the psychological transformation was equally complete. German pilots who had entered 1944 confident of victory now climbed into their cockpits expecting to die. American pilots who had once feared the sight of a Focke-Wulf now hunted them with aggressive, almost joyful, determination. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would finish the war as one of the top American aces, described the change in mentality. In January, we were glad when the Germans did not attack. By March, we were disappointed when they ran away. By May, we were frustrated because there were so few left to fight. The transformation was total. The success of Doolittle's strategy completely vindicated his initial, controversial gamble. But it created a profound historical irony. His decision, initially opposed by many bomber commanders as a reckless abandonment of their crews, had actually saved the daylight strategic bombing campaign. By systematically destroying the German fighter force before it could get to the bombers, the aggressive fighter sweeps proved to be far more protective than the old, defensive close escort tactics ever could have been. General Spaatz acknowledged this in a strategic assessment in June 1944. General Doolittle's decision to unleash the fighters was the decisive factor in winning air superiority. We destroyed more German fighters in 4 months than in the previous 2 years of combat. The key was allowing our fighters to hunt rather than forcing them to defend. A Major General Frederick L. Anderson, who had succeeded Ira Eaker as commander of bomber operations, admitted his initial opposition had been wrong. I believed keeping fighters close to bombers was the only way to protect them. I was wrong. Killing enemy fighters before they attack is far more effective than killing them during their attacks. General Doolittle understood this. I did not. The tactical revolution extended beyond mere doctrine to fundamentally change how air warfare was conceived for generations. Before Doolittle's January directive, escort fighters were seen as supplements to the bombers' own defensive firepower. After Big Week and the battles of early 1944, fighters were understood as the primary weapon for gaining and maintaining air superiority, with the bombers serving partly as the bait to bring the enemy fighters up into a decisive battle. This understanding would shape U.S. Air Force doctrine for the next half-century through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and into the modern era. Air superiority comes from destroying enemy air power proactively, not from protecting friendly aircraft reactively. But the human cost of this victorious strategy remained immense and somber. Over 10,000 American airmen died in the skies over Europe in the first half of 1944 alone. The bomber crews who flew mission after mission, watching friends and comrades die, knowing each sortie might be their last, demonstrated a level of courage that defies easy description. The fighter pilots who accepted the dangerous mission of hunting the Luftwaffe deep over enemy territory, far from help, demonstrated a unique blend of skill, aggression, and cold nerve. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who survived to become one of the leading American aces in Europe with 27 victories, reflected on the cost years later. We talk about tactics and strategy and numbers, but what really happened was that thousands of young men, most of them still boys, climbed into aircraft every day and flew into combat, knowing that many would not return. We won because we had more courage, more skill, better aircraft, better tactics, and better leadership. We won because Jimmy Doolittle understood that protecting bombers meant killing fighters, not staying close to bombers. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent, effective defensive organization. Individual groups continued to fight with desperate courage and occasionally achieved local successes. The revolutionary Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter showed its devastating potential, but it was too few, too late, and hamstrung by fuel shortages and Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber. The systematic destruction of the experienced pilot corps in the first half of the year was a blow from which the German Air Force could never recover. Germany would actually produce over 36,000 fighters in 1944, the highest annual total of the entire war. But there were not enough properly trained pilots to fly them, not enough fuel to train the pilots who did exist, not enough experienced leaders to develop and teach effective new tactics, and simply not enough time to rebuild what had been so efficiently destroyed in the spring. Captain Erich Rudorfer, one of the few German aces to survive the war with over 220 victories, summarized the hopeless situation. We had aircraft in abundance by late 1944. Modern fighters, even jets. But we had no experienced pilots to fly them. The Americans had killed all the good pilots in the spring. The war was already lost by the time our production finally peaked. The success of Doolittle's strategy created a template for modern air warfare that remains profoundly relevant today. The principles are timeless. Air superiority cannot be won defensively. It requires aggressive, relentless offensive action against the enemy's air power and its supporting infrastructure. Technological advantage is a critical force multiplier. The quality of training is more important than the quantity of equipment. Numerical superiority is decisive only when combined with qualitative superiority. And perhaps most importantly, leadership that is willing to challenge entrenched conventional wisdom and accept calculated, informed risk can produce strategic results that far exceed what is possible through incremental improvements to existing, failing methods. Doolittle's decision to change the sign on Kepner's wall was not merely a symbolic gesture. It was the physical representation of a fundamental reconceptualization of the very purpose of a fighter force. The bomber crews, who had initially feared Doolittle's tactics as a death sentence, came to understand and profoundly appreciate the new strategy. Technical Sergeant Andy Rooney, a Stars and Stripes reporter who flew on several bombing missions to cover the air war, wrote in June 1944, "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us." This sounds paradoxical, but it is the absolute truth. When they flew close to us, the Germans attacked anyway, and we fought it out. When they flew ahead and hunted, the Germans could not reach us in strength. The best defense was a good, violent, overwhelming offense. General Doolittle understood this. We did not. He was right. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the Allied air forces had achieved a level of air supremacy over Western Europe that was so complete it seemed almost peaceful. German aircraft still operated, but in such pitifully small numbers, and with such restricted effectiveness, that they could not meaningfully contest any Allied air or ground operation. The success of the D-Day landings and the subsequent campaign in France was achieved in significant part because the Allied soldier could fight without the constant, terrifying fear of enemy air attack that had characterized earlier campaigns. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, acknowledged this debt in his post-invasion assessment. The air forces gave us the one thing that was absolutely essential for success. They gave us the freedom to operate without enemy air interference. General Doolittle's fighter tactics destroyed the Luftwaffe at the moment when its destruction was most essential. History will judge this as one of the decisive campaigns of the entire war. The transformation from the despair of October 1943 to the triumph of June 1944 stands as one of the most dramatic and rapid reversals in military history. In October, the Luftwaffe was winning the battle of attrition over Germany. The American bomber losses were unsustainable. The entire premise of daylight strategic bombing seemed doomed to failure. Just 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was shattered, a broken force. American bombers now flew with minimal losses, and Allied ground forces prepared to invade Fortress Europe under a blanket of total air cover. The change was so complete and so swift that German commanders struggled to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe that had befallen them. General Galland, in his post-war memoirs, identified the turning point with precision and a soldier's respect for a worthy opponent. When the Americans changed their fighter tactics in January 1944, they won the air war in that moment. We could fight the American bombers. We could even fight their fighters if they stayed tied to the bombers. But we could not fight their fighters and their bombers simultaneously. Once they freed the fighters to hunt us, to attack us wherever we were doomed. The end was simply a matter of time. The final statistics of the campaign demonstrate its overwhelming, brutal success. Between January and December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 4,000 fighter pilots killed in action over the Reich. American and British fighters destroyed over 11,000 German fighters in air combat and in strafing attacks on the ground. German fighter pilot training time fell from over 200 hours in 1943 to less than 100 hours by late 1944. American losses in the same period totaled approximately 750 fighter pilots and 16,000 bomber crew casualties. These were grievous numbers, representing an ocean of personal tragedy, but American training schools graduated over 35,000 new pilots in 1944, and American factories produced an astonishing 63,000 military aircraft. The kill ratio in air combat shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters had achieved a positive kill ratio. In 1944, the ratio reversed dramatically, with American fighters achieving nearly 4 kills for every loss. By 1945, the ratio exceeded 7-1. But perhaps the most telling statistic of all was the experience level of the average pilot. In January 1944, the average German fighter pilot had over 200